Hello, my name is Henry Silverman, and I'd like to say a few words about the ethics of quarantine. First, is quarantine effective? And this brings up the contingent nature of evidence. On the pro side, according to the CDC, quarantine is medically very effective in protecting the public from disease. However, there are a few arguments against the use of quarantine. For example, quarantine is effective only if one is able to keep healthy people from moving around. It might be difficult to convince healthy people to stay put. Individuals might be afraid to go to hospitals with symptoms for fear of being isolated or quarantined. And studies have shown that less than 1% of those who are quarantined have shown to have had the disease. So one may ask, why do we use quarantine? Well, or why was it used in SARS? Well, this brings up the precautionary principle, which states where an activity raises threats of harm to the environment or human health, precautionary measures should be taken even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. Action, even coercive action, must be taken when there is a serious threat to the public's welfare, often in the face of uncertainty regarding not only the cause of the epidemic, but also the effect of the public health action. So in SARS, again, the precautionary principle seeks to implement preventative measures to respond to real or perceived risks in the face of uncertainty. In SARS, there was incomplete knowledge and inadequate evidence between cause and effect. Incomplete knowledge about the SARS virus and inadequate evidence regarding the effect of quarantine. However, the precautionary principle can also be used to justify virtually any restriction on liberty, so it must be used with caution. The harm principle backs up the precautionary principle. Again, as stated by Mill, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of the civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. Competent adults should have the freedom of action unless they pose a risk to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. However, I would like to emphasize that the harm principle, while necessary, is not a sufficient justification for the deprivation of liberty. So even if a quarantine can be said or thought to reduce harm to others, it still might not be justified. So again, the harm principle alone cannot justify the use of quarantine. So what other conditions do we need to have to justify an action, even if we have the harm principle? Well, again, we go back to our ethical framework. And once we have identified the public health goal and the likelihood of effectiveness and identified the burdens of the intervention, we use our proportionality test on whether the benefits outweigh the infringed moral considerations. And then we see whether the action is necessary. But then, equally important is that we need to see whether the action we want to take is such that it minimizes the infringement of the general moral consideration. This next slide shows the so-called intervention ladder, where we try to start with the least restrictive measures, and then we go up the ladder. So, for example, we may take on a policy of simply monitoring, or maybe just providing information, or doing things that could enable choice, or guide choices through incentives, or through disincentives. Or if these actions are not working, we may want to restrict choice or eliminate choice. Another concern with the least infringement means test, and this was shown in the DOT cases and the commitment of the mentally ill, the concern is that we are considering whether detention or commitment was the least restrictive that are existing. Courts previously have only looked at what are existing rather than requiring states to provide a range of least restrictive alternatives. The concern is that the seeds which nurtured such dangerous, non-compliant behavior, poverty, homelessness, social inequality, social exclusion, are not open to remedy. a quote from Richard Coker. So the issue is, are we doing things to address these issues first, which would represent least restrictive means, before we look at coercive measures? Well, once we have looked at necessity and least infringement, we need to look at the issue of justice, or whether there are disparate impact of the action. So in terms of quarantine, the concept is contained to pathogen, not to healthy subjects. Abuse of quarantine is most likely to occur during epidemics when people are most fearful and government officials are not anxious to take on strong actions. So for example, regarding fairness in quarantine, in 1892 there was a cholera outbreak in Europe. Ships from Europe were quarantined, but this quarantine was applied in an unfair manner. It had a disparate impact. The passengers of the lower socioeconomic standing were clearly subjected to separate, more severe conditions than wealthy passengers. Impoverished immigrants were sequestered below the deck without sanitary provisions during the confinement, whereas the wealthy passengers were treated differently. And as a result, the cholera spread disproportionately among the poor on board the vessels. Another example of unfairness in the application of quarantine, the plague in San Francisco in 1900. The boundaries for quarantine were arbitrarily established to include mainly a Chinese neighborhood, such that only households and businesses were included. Severe economic damage to the once thriving Chinese business community occurred. A federal court found that the quarantine was unconstitutional on grounds that it was unfair because of the disparate impact on the Chinese community. So we looked at several examples in our discussion forum. The Contagious Disease Act, we thought that that was unfair because it targeted only women. It had a disparate impact, and there were concerns about how does one reduce the spread of sexually transmitted infections if not apply only to men. When quarantine is applied in a discriminatory manner, can it really be effective? Another concept of justice includes procedural justice. So in addition to whether it's being applied fairly, we look at the process of applying it. Was there a fair process? And I think many wrote in the discussion forum concerns with the Contagious Disease Act in regard to how the act led to the isolation of the women for up to 9 months without due process, without an appeal process, without determining whether they actually harbored the illness. The same thing with the mentally ill. 50, 60, 70 years ago, commitment was done without a due process, and many people who were not mentally ill was committed based on prejudice. Now we have, as many discussed, that in order to commit involuntarily the mentally ill, we have a due process whereby 2 physicians need to certify that a person is either a harm to him or herself or to others, and within 72 hours that needs to be reviewed, and within 10 days that needs to be reviewed by the courts. The issue that was discussed regarding DOT therapy in our discussion forum was the concern that targeted groups who were thought less likely to adhere to DOT were subject to directly observed therapy. The issue is, how do we determine who are thought less likely to adhere to DOT? And the concern is that this would be applied unfairly based on issues of poverty, issues of race, homelessness. Now, why do we think that these individuals are less likely to adhere to DOT? And if we exclude the wealthy from DOT therapy, how do we contain the illness? Again, this is an issue of procedural justice. So in conclusion, The ethical issues regarding quarantine regards the infringement of civil liberties, including the invasion of privacy. Could it be discriminatory? Also, is there reciprocity? Are there individuals who are burdened by quarantine? Do we institute ways to relieve their burden? And what are the costs? Psychological, traumatic costs, disruption of social structures, loss of trust. And are we using the least restrictive means? So, for example, are we using mandatory or could we use voluntary? And are there procedural safeguards so that we don't unfairly commit people to quarantine? Thank you very much.